Bonjour et bienvenue à tous et à toutes. Nous sommes heureux de vous accueillir à la dernière présentation de cette 5e école d'été en sciences humaines numériques. Je suis Jada Watson, coordonnatrice de l'école d'été et des sciences humaines numériques à l'Université d'Ottawa. Je suis ravie d'être la modératrice de la présentation d'aujourd'hui. Good morning and welcome to this final keynote presentation of the 5th iteration of Digital Humanities Summer Institute Technologies East. I'm Jada Watson, coordinator of the Summer Institute and of Digital Humanities at the University of Ottawa. I'm thrilled to be moderating today's keynote presentation. Before I pass the screen over to the Dean of the Faculty of Arts, who will introduce our speaker, I would like to offer a land acknowledgement, excuse me, and I invite you all to share in the chat an acknowledgement for the land from which you are joining us today. Nous rendons hommage au peuple algonquin, gardien traditionnel de cette terre. Nous reconnaissons le lien sacré de longue date, l'unissant à ce territoire qui demeure non cédé. Nous rendons également hommage à tous les peuples autochtones qui habitent Ottawa, qu'ils soient de la région ou d'ailleurs au Canada. Nous reconnaissons les gardiens des savoirs traditionnels, jeunes et âgés. Nous honorons aussi leurs courageux dirigeants d'hier, d'aujourd'hui et de demain. We pay respect to the Algonquin people, who are the traditional guardians of this land. We acknowledge their long-standing relationship with this territory, which remains unceded. We pay respect to all Indigenous people in this region from all nations across Canada who call Ottawa home. We acknowledge the traditional knowledge keepers, both young and old, and we honor their courageous leaders, past, present, and future. I will now turn the screen over to Dean Key.
Thanks, Jada. Hi, everybody. Welcome to the final keynote speaker of DHSITE 2022. I'm Kevin Key, Dean of the Faculty of Arts, and I'm so happy to be introducing our final speaker. As you know, digital humanities seeks to enrich our understanding of the human record through interpretation and analysis, and this work is pressing. We are unable to make informed environmental, political. This would be the moment that the folks outside are cutting the lawn. I apologize. We're not able to make environmental or political or social decisions without understanding cultural or industrial systems around us and questioning their structural orientations. And DHSITE 2022 has been centered around developing a foundation in feminist-oriented theory and practices under this rubric of futures. This theme emerged organically out of the workshop themes, which were oriented around building equitable, inclusive, diverse, and sustainable futures for teaching, learning, research, and more. It was also inspired by the work of our two keynote presenters, whose work is critical to building new tools and frameworks that challenge, call out, and abolish hierarchies, not just within the cultural domains in which they work, but also in academia writ large. On Tuesday, we heard about open scholarship. And today we're going to learn more about the foundational work of our guest, Dr. Dre Klein, in the field of data feminism. What is data feminism? How is feminist thinking being incorporated into data-driven work? And how are scholars in the humanities, in particular, this is my wife, Anne-Marie.
I'm so sorry, I'm just getting the cottage keys.
And how are scholars in the humanities, in particular, bringing together data science, data visualization, and feminist theory in their research? Drawing from a recent work, Data Feminism, co-authored with Catherine D'Ignazio, Dre Klein will speak about data feminism in action. And she will present, a set of principles for doing data science that are informed by the past several decades of intersectional feminist activism and critical thought. We are thrilled to be hosting Dr. Klein, who, as you all know, is a leader in the digital humanities research domain. Dre Klein is Winship Distinguished Research Professor and Associate Professor in the departments of English and Quantitative Theory and Methods at Emory University, where she also directs the Digital Humanities Lab. Before moving to Emory, she taught in the School of Literature, Media, and Communication at Georgia Tech. In 2017, she was named one of the rising stars in digital humanities by Inside Higher Ed. Dr. Klein works at the intersection of digital humanities, data science, and early American literature with a focus on issues of gender and race. She has designed platforms for exploring the contents of historical newspapers, modeled the invisible labor of women abolitionists, and recreated forgotten visualization schemes with fabric and addressable LEDs. She's the author of An Archive of Taste, Race, and Eating in the Early United States, published by the University of Minnesota Press, and with Catherine D'Ignazio, Data Feminism, published by MIT Press. She also edits Debates in the Digital Humanities, a hybrid print-digital publication stream that explores debates in the field as they emerge, with Matthew K. Gold. Her work has appeared in leading humanities journals, including PAMLA, American Literature, and American Quarterly. And she's presented at technical conferences, including NACCL, EMNLP, and IEEE Viz. Her research has been supported by grants from the NEH and the Mellon Foundation. Her current project, Data by Design, an interactive history of data visualization from 1786 to 1900, was recently funded by an NEH Digital Humanities Advancement Grant. She is no stranger to you, so let me simply say, I'm so glad you're here, Dr. Klein. Please join me in welcoming her, and I turn the screen over to our plenary speaker.
Thank you so much for that really kind introduction. I'm going to share my screen and get started. So I slightly changed the title of my talk, but the contents are roughly the same. What I'm going to do is explore the idea of data feminism in relation to the digital humanities. And more specifically, I'm going to be talking about how feminism and intersectional feminism in particular can help us develop more ethical and equitable data practices, particularly as they relate to the data included in DH projects, or the data not included within DH projects, as the case may be. And before I move forward, I do want to acknowledge that much of the conceptual framework from this talk does come from this book that I co-authored with Catherine D'Ignazio. You can see her right here on this next slide. And if you're curious about the book, it's available open access via the URL that's at the bottom of this slide right here, datafeminism.io. And just one more thing that I want to say before getting started is that this book, it wasn't intended as a digital humanities book, at least not explicitly. And I do want to acknowledge that there is all sorts of work that does sit explicitly at the intersection of DH and feminism, including, it sounds like, much of the work that you've been learning from and working with over the past week. This is work that predates this project by, in some cases, decades. So I think of the longstanding work of Susan Brown and the Orlando Project, Jackie Wernemann and Liz Loesch's book in the Debates in the Digital Humanities series called Bodies of Information about intersectional feminist DH, the Women Writers Project led by Julia Flanders. I could go on. But sort of this small sampling are some of the projects that have really deeply and profoundly influenced my thinking over the past many years. And even though I would say probably most of those projects are not named in Data Feminism, the book, they are in many ways what enabled me to see the connections, the conceptual connections between the theory and the practices that the book tries to set out. And so what I'm going to do today is briefly summarize this conceptual framework about how feminism and data science can be brought together before moving on to a set of examples that illustrate this idea of data feminism in action. And I'm going to do so with a particular emphasis on digital humanities work involving data, as I mentioned before. So I'll jump right in. So the motivating premise of our book is that in the world today, data is a tremendous form of power. In certain situations, data science has been used for tremendous benefit, to advance medical discovery in certain cases, to document certain instances of oppression at scale. But it's also resulted in significant harm. For example, you might think of the pretrial risk assessment algorithm, now somewhat famously investigated by ProPublica, which was shown to discriminate against Black and brown defendants. You could think of the work by Virginia Eubanks on the algorithmic system put in place in Pennsylvania in the United States to flag parents suspected of child abuse, very often unfairly, and with understandably really devastating consequences. It seems like almost every week in the news there's another example of this type of thing, to the point where I could really fill an entire talk with just examples of the ways in which data systems and sort of algorithms more generally have been unleashed upon the world to tremendous harm. But the point that I want to make here by way of these examples is this one. It's that data are incredibly powerful, but that power is currently wielded unequally. And it's wielded unequally in a specific way by a small and homogenous group of corporations and other well-resourced institutions, including educational institutions. They are the ones who have the resources to design and deploy these data systems for their own benefit, where benefit often includes profit, and very often at the expense of everyone else. And this is where feminism enters in. And what we explain in the book is how feminism, and intersectional feminism in particular, has been focused on precisely this thing for a very long time. So it's been focused on imbalances of power and the structural forces that cause them. This is in many ways the project of feminism. But if you wanted to put it another way, we, or sort of society writ large, I would say DH people are in general more attuned to this, but society is just sort of tuning into the evidence of what is referred to in the technical literature of as the brittleness of data systems that have been optimized for certain situations and not others, or optimized for only certain groups of people and not others. The basic idea that systems are optimized for certain groups and not others, this is not at all new to feminists, because again, feminists have long studied unequal systems of power. Or similarly, the narrative of surprise that accompanies the discovery of bias in a training data set that results in a sexist or racist or ableist or otherwise discriminatory model. The idea that biases are sort of baked into not just the cultural record, but actually the scientific record. This has been a topic of feminist STS scholarship for decades. So that's essentially the sort of the setup for the book. But I do want to back up for a minute, because I think that many of you may be listening to this and thinking, but wait a minute, feminism, it means so many different things to so many different people. So what exactly is the feminism that you're describing in the book? And so I actually want to take some time to answer that question, because it's an important one. And I will say, the book was written for a general audience, as I mentioned before. So we start out with a really simple definition. We say that feminism at its core entails a belief in equality for all genders. So this includes both cis and trans women, as well as non-binary folks and also men. But if you take a look around you, you realize that this goal of equality has not yet been realized in the world. And so feminism also and necessarily involves organized activity on behalf of women and non-binary people to make this goal of equality the reality. And I'll have more to say on what this activity should entail in a minute, because not all action on behalf of gender equality has the same impact. So for example, some narrowly focused activism that might be aimed at elevating certain individual women to the ranks of equally powerful men, this can actually result in significant societal and collective harm. But before I get there, I just want to acknowledge the third definition, which again, as sort of for a DH audience and an academic audience in general, is not surprising, but this is sort of the third component that we introduce. And this has to do with the sort of set of theories and ideas. And these theories began by thinking through issues of inequality with respect to sex and gender. But if you just sort of look at how the past 40 years of scholarship have unfolded, and just, the political reality that's accompanied those 40 years, that has resulted in many, many more dimensions of inequality being brought to the conversation. So these include race, these include class, these include sexual orientation, ability, and so on. And so this sort of brings me back up to the idea of intersectional feminism. And this, again, is likely a familiar term to you. You know this, it comes to us from the work of women of color feminists and Black feminists in particular. But What feminism in general gains from these specific theoretical concepts, like you could think of the Combahee River Collective's formulation of interlocking systems of oppression, Kimberly Crenshaw's term intersectionality, Patricia Hill Collins's idea of the matrix of domination. These are all frameworks that structure critiques of power. So, in other words, they help to show or at least illuminate the reasons why certain people, including but not limited to women, might experience oppression on the one hand or privilege on the other. And the intersection and intersectionality, this comes from the view that it's not possible to isolate certain forces of privilege or oppression from others. We might be interested in the effects of sexism, for example, but we need to recognize that other forces, again, including colonialism, including classism, including racism, they interlock and intersect with each other in ways that are really impossible to separate, and also notably in ways that compound their effects. So I just want to come back briefly to this question about what feminist activism should properly entail. And our view, and this is something that we underscore in the book, is that feminist activism and sort of action more generally must intervene in issues of power. So if gender justice is to be achieved, it will only be achieved together with racial justice, with economic justice, with disability justice, and so on. And also, importantly, this movement needs to be led by folks with the most direct experience with these issues of injustice, working in coalition with everybody else. So just to sum up the sort of introductory portion of my talk, the basic argument that we make in the book is that intersectional feminism, when applied to data science, can help the unequal balance of power that we currently see manifested in the world of data and data science today be challenged and ideally rebalanced and changed. Oh my gosh, and speaking of interruptions, it's just thundered a ton in my neighborhood, which means that my internet may become very spotty. So if I cut in and out, that is the reason why. But if you just wanted to sort of think about the thesis of the book in simpler terms, data science really needs feminism and intersectional feminism in particular, if we ever hope to overturn these power imbalances that all sorts of people are encountering every day. So what we do in the book is use the teachings of intersectional feminism, supplemented by ideas from other areas of feminist activism and critical thought, in order to arrive at these 7 principles for doing more ethical and equitable data science. So you can see them right here, but I'll also read them. They're examine power, challenge power, rethink binaries and hierarchies, elevate emotion and embodiment, embrace pluralism, consider context, and make labor visible. And our goal with these principles was, put bluntly, to operationalize feminism for data science. So to provide a clear set of principles for people currently working with data, for people who want to work with data, including students, or for people who want to refuse to work with data for ideological or political reasons. And in the book, we have one chapter devoted to each one of these principles, where we talk about the feminist theory that underlies that particular principle and then illustrate how it can be applied to data science through a lot of examples. And I don't have enough time in my talk today, nor do I want to spend all of my talk today sort of going through each of these chapters one by one. But what I am going to do is walk you through a couple of examples that we do talk about in the book, and then some newer ones, both of work that has emerged just in the time since the book was first published, which was literally the first week of the pandemic in March 2020, as well as some work that Catherine and I personally have done since writing the book, that has been intentionally undertaken with this idea of mobilizing data in order to challenge power. So I'm just going to jump in, and I'm going to start with this project. It's called The Library of Missing Datasets. It's by the artist and educator Mimi Unwoha. And it's very central to this principle of examining power, this first principle that we talk about in the book. And I was also very pleased to see it was just reviewed in reviews in DH just this past month. So even though I'm not sure, I view it more as an art project than a digital humanities project, I'm really, really glad to see that nice crossover. In any case, this project is displayed in two ways. So the first is actually as a GitHub repository. This lists the missing data sets that you can see here, screenshotted on the right. So if you can read this, or you can actually just Google it and find the site itself, you'll see titles like trans people killed or injured in instances of hate crime, people excluded from public housing in the United States because of criminal records. You know, this artwork, it was created pre-COVID. You can see the first year of it was 2016. But the ways that COVID has had such disparate impacts across pretty much all social groups and all around the world, I think this has awakened all of us to the dangers of missing data. In any case, the second way to encounter this artwork is as a physical installation. That's the file cabinet on the left. And the idea is that you walk into the gallery, you see this file cabinet with folders, you read the names of the data sets on the tabs of the folders, you might tab through them, stop at one you think seems interesting or important. But when you go to open the folder, you discover that the folder is empty. So here, the data sets are physically missing. And the point that Onuoha is trying to make in this piece with the empty file folders and the like is that these data sets, they're missing for a reason. And that reason is this profound imbalance of power with respect to data collection in the world today. So this imbalance of power is what determines what data are collected and what are not. And then in turn, what research can be conducted and what research cannot. Again, you know, governments have this power, moneyed institutions have this power, and minoritized groups generally do not. So this is why a feminist approach to data and to data science begins with an analysis of power, because far too often the data sets that we can access, and in turn the questions that they prompt, have already been affected by the imbalances of power in the world. So the same principle about examining and challenging power, it also applies to projects that use historical data or in some cases create the historical data themselves. And one of my favorite projects in general involving historical data, and it happens to be a DH project as well, really exemplifies this goal of challenging unequal power. It's the one that you're looking at here, the Color Conventions project. It was developed by a collaborative team at Penn State. So the color conventions, if you're not familiar with them, these were events that took place in the 19th century, both in the United States and interestingly also in Canada, in which Black Americans, Black Canadians, both fugitive and free, gathered in order to strategize in person about how to achieve legal, social, economic, and educational justice. Now, I'm less certain of the sort of a national narrative in Canada, but at least in the United States, there's sort of a standard story of the abolition of slavery that is told, you know, in high schools and the like, that tends to credit the white abolitionists for really leading the cause. But that's primarily because their efforts were recorded in newspapers, which have been preserved and archived, and the minutes of these in-person meetings were not. So the power that the Color Conventions project is challenging here is in effect the power of the archive, right? And they're doing it by assembling their own counter archive, as well as interestingly, by creating a counter data set. So as part of this project, they're making a machine readable version of the meeting minutes that can be incorporated back into computational analyses of that era, and in that way restore some of the credit to the Black Americans who were actively working for abolition, but who tend to be overlooked in these dominant historical accounts. And very, very briefly, there's a second issue that the Color Convention project takes up, and that's related to missing data and challenging these forces of power that control, I would say, both archives and also narratives. And this has to do with the fact that the data set, because it's derived from these official meeting minutes, it only records the discussions of official participants. And these participants were almost exclusively men. So here you see a sketch that I believe was unearthed by Jim Casey of the CCP team, which shows the women in the back and actually women throughout the session, even though if you look at the meeting minutes, they're almost exclusively names of men. So in order to address this disparity, the Color Conventions team asks its teaching partners to sign a formal memo of understanding before introducing students to the project. And this MOU requests that all instructors introduce a woman involved in the conventions, like a wife or a daughter or a sister or a fellow church member, alongside every male delegate who is named. And then from this work of recovery, the team is creating a second data set of these women's names. And so these are women who would otherwise go wholly uncounted and therefore unrecognized for the work that they did. So this is actually one of my own projects that I've undertaken in collaboration with Sandeep Soni, who's a postdoc now at UC Berkeley, and Jacob Eisenstein, who's now at Google, but was at Georgia Tech, where I was also at the time. And this project was in many ways inspired by what the Color Conventions Project has taught all of us, and especially me. You know, I'm an early Americanist by training, so this is a time period that really resonates for me. So here you see more of a technical paper involving the development of a computational model of language change. And our focus was on the changing meaning of important keywords like freedom or like justice over the course of the 19th century as the movement to end slavery gathered force. And if you're interested more specifically, we use diachronic word embeddings to analyze what are in effect like the literal terms of debate, right? So we were interested in who is shaping these terms, whether or not the people that our model identified as being leaders in this conversation were the same people who historians and cultural studies scholars have traditionally credited with leading the conversation. And we were, in similar ways to the Color Conventions Project, although sort of through different methods, interested about what these words could tell us about the process by which social and political change takes place. And so I'm not going to get too much into the weeds here. You can look at the paper if you're curious through this link. But one of the interesting things that you can see on the slide is how this concept of freedom, for example, over here, it begins at the first part of the century being used in this really general sense, just associated with like people and country. One of the interesting things that you can see on the slide is how over the course of the 19th century, as the movement to end slavery gathers force, this word acquires a more precise definition. So it starts being applied in the closer context of things like rights or the Constitution or the question of whether or not freedom is universal and such like that. Just one more part of this project. We also did a network analysis in which we aggregated these word changes by their source so we could try to identify some broader patterns. And here we were really interested in questions about how ideas might have moved from the margins to the mainstream. So like, who is actually doing the work of radical change? And so this part of the project not only addresses questions of power, but also questions of labor and credit. And these are actually also feminist concerns, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about labor a little bit later. But again, just one little interesting detail to point out on this chart. So this plots the sources that adopted changes from other sources. So they sort of like borrowed or sort of heard someone else use a new word and then decided to use that as well on the x-axis, and then the people who are introducing new changes on the y-axis. What we see is how women edited newspapers, both black and white, introduced new word uses in far greater proportion to the words that they adopted from others. Those are these up here on the left, including the provincial Freeman, which was actually located in Canada West, which I guess is now Ontario, right? I think so. And actually another really interesting finding is that of these papers, you know, you could say this might be evidence of sort of some sort of interracial solidarity, except one of the things that we do know about the Lily, a white women's suffrage newspaper, is that these women, even as they supported the cause of emancipation, were themselves deeply racist. And so one of the really interesting questions that I'm still thinking about is what this means that you do get key influences from people who were themselves not wholeheartedly aligned with the full mission of the abolitionist movement. So before I move on, this actually brings me to two important caveats that I want to make. And so first of all, both the idea that Black women were leaders in the abolitionist movement, or that the white women who were involved in the abolitionist movement were themselves quite racist. Like, this is not news, either to qualitative researchers in the present or to the Black women who were themselves involved in the movement. So on the right, you can actually see a quote from Frances Harper from a speech she made at an actual abolitionist organizing meeting attesting to this fact. But we see this play out, this sort of the power of statistical proof in all sorts of data science projects in the present. That are mostly turning up evidence of things that people already knew. Like, is it news to people of color that racism exists? Like, no, not at all. Is it news to women in technical fields that my experience is often delegitimized? Like, no, this is not news. So even as we frame our models or certain features as holding tremendous statistical or explanatory power, we need to remember that actual people are experiencing the real world effects that are confirmed by these models every single day. And so this brings me up to the second caveat, which has to do with what I'll term the seduction of scale. So this is the belief that bigger data is always better data, and that the more data that you have, it will always and sort of destined to give you more information about the issue you're seeking to explore. And I'm actually going to dig into this one a little bit more, this particular caveat, via a comparison between the two projects that you see up here on the screen. And these are both projects that we talk about in the book in the context of the principle of embracing pluralism, meaning bringing many and multiple people to the data science table. But I would say its lessons are really not limited to the importance of inclusion alone, and that's what I want to get at a little bit here. So I'm going to tell you a little bit more about this first map. So this was created by San Francisco's Anti-Eviction Mapping Project. This is a project and a team, a collective that works in collaboration with tenants' rights organizations and community groups in the Bay Area in order to collect and map data about the eviction crisis there. And I would say this project is sort of DH adjacent. There's actually an interesting piece about it in the special issue of American Quarterly that was devoted to digital humanities. But I would say that it emerges just as much from the field of critical does DH. And those are actually two fields that I think could stand to be better aligned. And we can talk more about that later if that's a thing that interests you. In any case, each of these little red dots on the map are a place where a person or a family was evicted from their home. And then the blue dots indicate places where the AEMP has also interviewed one of the people who was evicted from that place. So if you click on one of the blue dots, it brings up one of these video interviews, and you can just see one screenshotted up here. This is a woman named Phyllis Bowie who's facing eviction. And in the book, we draw a contrast between the AEMP map with that of the eviction lab. So this is a map or a project rather, that's based at Princeton. It's emphatically not a digital humanities project. It comes from the social sciences. Its goal is to present a national picture of the eviction crisis. And I should say, this is a really worthy goal. It's a really valuable project, but it's really wildly different in terms of process than the AEMP map that I was just showing you. So you might look at this and think, okay, I think I'm looking at bigger data, right? I'm certainly looking at a map of the entire United States. I think it's more comprehensive. You might look at it and think, I think it's a little bit more rigorous, right? They're not just using Google Maps. They're using Mapbox or some sort of slightly fancier mapping library. But one of the really interesting things is that the AEMP, who has been in direct dialogue with this project, they've shown that these national real estate databases from which this data is drawn, they significantly undercount evictions. And you can think again, as soon as you stop to think, you can think about the reasons why this might be true, right? So first of all, the real estate industry, not incentivized to count any more evictions than they absolutely have to. It's bad for business. It would invite oversight. They don't want that. And then the other reason, and I think this is something that students actually have experienced a lot, is there's all sorts of ways for landlords to get you to leave your apartment that don't involve being actually served with a formal eviction notice, right? The landlord can not fix the leak in your ceiling, or lurk in your lobby or just raise your rent a lot, right? So these are ways that are sort of de facto evictions, but they're not registered in the official tally of evictions in the national database. However, because the AEMP is working with local community organizations, so the places where people go and they say, like, help me, this is happening to me, what do I do? And the AEMP compiles data from that spot. They've actually gathered what is probably messier, but actually more accurate and more contextualized data that documents a greater extent of the problem at hand. And this is what's gained by embracing pluralism. So just a couple more, like a little bit more editorializing about pluralism. So sort of up till now, there's been very little work done on what pluralistic processes for data science look like. And to be honest, not that much more work about pluralism in DH scholarship. And this actually stands in sharp contrast to fields like HCI and design that have a very long track record of research around public process and things like participatory design and co-design. But a commitment to feminist knowledge production, by definition, entails a commitment to bringing more people and more perspectives to the table. So we really need to start figuring out what this will look like in a data science context. And one of the questions that immediately arises when you start to ask these questions or sort of focus on this is whose perspectives to prioritize, right? Like, you can recognize the fact that you can't bring literally everyone to the design table. You can recognize the realities that oftentimes we're working with limited budgets, limited amounts of time, and timelines that are imposed from people, not ourselves. And so you can spend a significant amount of time sort of wringing your hands and thinking about how hard this is. But this is actually one of the places where feminist theory has a very clear answer to what you should do. So you can follow the work of folks like Sandra Harding, Patricia Hill Collins, Shawan Bardzell, and insist that if you are going to take power into account, this means centering the people at the edges and the margins first and foremost. So essentially making design decisions not for the normative or sort of average user, but in fact from the outside in. And I want to give just a quick shout out to Catherine's new work with the Data Against Feminicide project. And in this project, she's actually trying to take very seriously this commitment to embracing pluralism. So this means that as much as she wants to be building tools to help these activists manage their data, she needs to prioritize listening to the activists themselves and learning from them about what tools they need, if any. And one of the really big lessons for this project was that when Catherine asked these questions of the activists and heard what they had to say, she realized that just as much as technical tools for managing these types of data workflows, they also just really needed community and support for that community because of the difficult nature of the work that they do, which is just as much about the work of honor and commemoration, sort of feeling these losses one by one, as it is about building a data set that can later attest in more public and broader contexts to this fact. So I'm going to shift gears here. So the first set of examples, they've focused on the issue of power and people. So the people who have power and then the people who don't. But another major idea that comes from feminism, and again, this is probably not a surprise to many of you listening, this relates to more conceptual structures of power, and more specifically to binary structures that are defined by a hard distinction between two groups. And one of the major contributions of feminist theory is to show how these binary distinctions, they're usually hiding a hierarchy with one group on top and the other on the bottom. And once you start to see the hierarchy, it makes sense why that hard line between the groups is there in the first place. And it's an enforcement mechanism, right? It's a method of controlling power. It's in order to ensure that the people who are on the bottom of this power hierarchy aren't able to sort of like creep up in and take power from those at the top. So you could think, about the distinction between the idea of man and woman, right? This is the obvious reference point because it's a clear example of both a false binary and an unequal hierarchy, right? There are more than two genders, and among them, no gender is intrinsically better than any of the others. But one of the key moves of feminist theorists is to take this critique of the gender binary and use it to question other binaries and hierarchies that we encounter in the world, like the distinction between nature and culture. You could think of Donna Haraway's Cyborg Manifesto, between teacher and student. You could think of all of the different articulations of feminist pedagogy that question the reality that we know to be true as both teachers and students, which is that there is a very even teaching exchange of knowledge that takes place in the classroom, that it's very difficult to separate who is exactly teaching who in any classroom configuration. And it also starts to point out the reason why the hierarchy between teacher and student might have been imposed in the first place, which was to preserve the power of the teacher as the person of authority, right? But I'm actually going to use this sort of conceptual critique in order to look at another binary or false binary, which is the distinction between reason and emotion. So in the sort of Anglo-Western dominant context in which most of our education takes place, we've been taught that reason is somehow better than emotion. And we can see this play out in data and in data visualization in particular. Best practices for data visualization often involve a clean design, minimalist aesthetic, presenting just the facts. But the question remains, like, why are these our best practices, especially when research in this same field, so the field of data visualization, has shown that we interpret these aesthetic choices just as emotionally. So we tend to believe that these types of charts are actually more truthful than they actually are. So you could think of research by Jessica Holman at Northwestern that has shown how just including a source line for data visualization makes a viewer trust it more. It doesn't matter whether the credit line actually points to an actual source. Or the inverse, there's been some really interesting work recently by Crystal Lee at MIT, who looks at the data visualizations mobilized by COVID deniers and has shown how people who spread totally made up facts and statistics about COVID and hoaxes and vaccines and whatever actually accompany these made up numbers with very traditional seeming visual typologies like bar charts, like time series charts, like pie charts, because they know that these visual conventions lend authority to these otherwise totally falsified facts. But I want to think for a minute about the opposite, about visualizations that intentionally leverage emotion. And that's what the next example that I'm going to share helps us think through. And I want to, again, sort of give you a little bit of a warning that this is actually a visualization about gun violence. And, given the events of the past 10 days, and Uvalde, I thought really hard about whether or not I should show this to you, but I feel like this work is so urgently needed, now more than ever. And so if you want to, turn off your screen or look away or whatever, there's no scenes of violence, but it's about gun violence. So I thought I would preface the next slide with that. So this is, there's screenshots from an animated visualization. It's by the design firm Periscopic. And what this visualization shows is the number of gun-related deaths in the United States in a particular calendar year. So they've done this since, I believe, 2013. I think it goes up through 2018. And what you would see if you go to the URL on the screen is each of the people killed by a gun in a particular calendar year, and you see them traced out one by one as single arcs. So that's actually what you can see in these small screenshots. They start out really slow, so you can read the names of each of the people, but then they get faster and faster until you can no longer keep up. And they also start to overlap with each other, so you can't even pick out the individual arcs that correspond to individuals anymore. And it results in the end in this sort of semicircular web that you see. It's really overwhelming to watch, like even before, the current context. I find it like almost unbearable. It's sort of like you think it should be done and it's not done. It just keeps on going. You think certainly, all of the people have been plotted on this chart, but there's still more people to plot. But that's kind of the point, right? It goes on for too long because there are too many people being killed by guns. Too many deaths are plotted on this same visualization because too many people are actually being killed, right? So another, visualization convention that they play with, there's something called occlusion, which in visualization design is the principle that you should always be able to pick out individual data points. This is considered to be like the good way, the best practice for presenting data. But the point that they want to make is like there's literally too many people dying, and so it is not possible in order to, like these people, there's too many people to plot with differentiation on this particular chart. And I should just also back up, or not back up, but just make clear to say that, methodologically, it's no less statistically sound than any other study, right? The data about the people, they derive from a national crime data set released by the US federal government. One of the things that it does is it projects the lifespan of each person had they not been killed at that time. And that projection is done using a model released by the World Health Organization. So that itself has been backed up by lots of research. But it was viewed, the visualization was viewed with really intense suspicion from the visualization community because it made us feel things. It activated our emotions. And a feminist approach here would say, that's not a problem at all that it made us feel things. And actually, it's a more compelling visualization precisely because it blends reason with emotion. And if you allow yourself to rebalance emotion and reason, what it opens up is this much richer and more, I think, more effective data communication toolbox that in turn allows you or me to focus on what really matters, right? So honoring the context of the data, listening to the experience that it represents, and using our work to take action against all of the injustice and the real problems, the visceral problems that we encounter in the world today. So to sort of connect this back to digital humanities, there actually is this digital humanities project that's pretty recent that takes a lot of what I've been saying to heart. It's called Homegoing. It's a project by COVID Black that's directed by Kim Gallen, who was at Purdue and Johns Hopkins, but is now moving to Brown. And with this project, what Gallen and her team have done is created a digital memorial to the Black Americans who have died of COVID. And so you can see, this is a screenshot on the left. The theme of this project, or the themes, are data and honor. And what the team did first was simply to gather the names of the people who had died. But they decided not to visualize these people merely as data points. They painstakingly, and this took a lot of time, tracked down photos and obituaries for each of the people who were named in the data set. And if you go to the visualization, if you click on one of the small names or small photos, it brings up a larger photo that is accompanied by a biography of this person with a link to the news source that it came from. And what this project is doing, that has a very clear articulation of its goals. It's refusing to let these people be anonymized as data points. And it's really insisting that we recognize each individual life that the data represents. And in this way, it challenges structural power as well. So the idea of homegoing, as Gallen explains on the site, this is a way of celebrating and paying respect to Black people in death in a way that is not often given them in life. This is, true for homegoing ceremonies in general, but it's again made explicit on the site. And we live in this time when Black Americans are being killed by COVID at a rate of at least twice that of white Americans. And so this memorial is sort of witnessing and testifying to that fact. So I'm going to start to wrap up here, and I am just going to sort of end with sort of a summary slide. So if it's not already apparent, the principles of data feminism, they can apply to every stage of a data science project, from inception and funding to production to circulation and impact in the world. And this sort of brings me to the last point that I want to make before the Q&A. And again, it's probably obvious from these examples, but it's that data feminism insists on an expanded definition of data work, and of data science. So our data science is not defined by the size of the data set or the technical credentials of the people undertaking the work, because these credentials these concerns are continually used to exclude women and people of color from the field, as well as to exclude work that makes a contribution that is perhaps humanistic or socio-technical rather than purely technical or methodological. But if we expand our definition of data science, then we can see clearly that some of the most exciting work today is being undertaken by humanists, by artists, by journalists, by community organizers, by activists. And, sure, some of this, it does look like traditional data science. So here's a paper. This actually just won a long-standing achievement award in the natural language processing world. It's a paper by Margaret Mitchell and her team at what I believe was then Microsoft Research, for really early work that called out issues of bias in natural language processing techniques. But then, in the middle, you see this is an interactive sculpture by the artist Stephanie Dinkins works sort of like an Amazon Echo, but trained on an intergenerational dialogue between the women and her family. And then on the right, you see this is a explicitly DH project, Torn Apart, Separados. This is a project which calls attention to the sort of tentacles and nefarious reach of ICE immigration and customs enforcement contracts in the United States. And then on the bottom, you see this is what's a data mural created by the group called Data Therapy, and they work with community-based organizations to analyze and then visualize their own data, but ultimately visualizing it in the form of one of these murals like you see, that's usually painted in the organization's yard or in the community that it serves. So the book, it has a lot, hundreds of examples like this, and we've selected them to illustrate our points and to try to inspire our readers to action. Because, one thing that, and this is sort of where I'll close, if you think back to where I began my talk today, data it's at the root of so many problems, and increasingly at the root of, as the world becomes more and more datafied, it will only increasingly be the source of the problems that we face today. But one of the things that Catherine and I really do believe is that data, when wielded with intention and with care, and in the service of the communities that we're hoping to support, it can also be part of the solution. And I think, in terms of the specific tasks of identifying missing data sets, making accessible, interpretable, or public other forms of cultural heritage, facilitating the creation of future knowledge, I think that DH scholars have a lot to contribute to that task. So that's where I'll end today. Here's a lot of different ways to get in touch with me on the web, Twitter, Instagram, GitHub. If you feel like it, you can download an infographic with the data feminism principles. I believe we have both English and French, as well as a couple of other languages. But now I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I'll be very interested to hear your questions. Thanks for listening.
Thank you so much. I feel so fortunate that you have been able, thank you for answering that question. I was going to ask you that. So fortunate that you were able to join us today. In the early days of pandemic, Dr. Klein and Dr. D'Ignazio held a weekly reading group for data feminism on Zoom. I think weekly. Lauren, was it about 300 who joined every week?
It was a lot. It was a surprising number.
Yeah, there were a lot of us. And I still turn back to those videos and I've used them in my teaching throughout the last year. There's something that I just wanted to mention. There was a comment in the chat earlier as you were speaking about the narratives that sort of get ignored by colonialism and white supremacy. For my colleague here at UWattawa, Felicity Taylor, who says, we have the narrative of the Underground Railroad and Canada being a benevolent place that welcomed freed slaves, which erases the national history of slavery. And I think to that I would add the ways in which narratives get flipped now with I want to choose my words carefully, recent findings of mass burial graves for Indigenous peoples, and of course our Indigenous population has known for at least 100 years that those burial sites were there. So labeling them as discoveries and talking about them as though, the predominantly white government has found them is erasing a narrative that is already known by our population. So thank you for highlighting that. If anyone has questions, please do put them in the Q&A. Okay, we have one. Hi, Lauren. Thanks so much for this talk. I'm a humanist and very interested in data, but I don't think of what I do as data science. It does feel sciencey, though. How would you define that term, especially in a DH context?
That's a really good question. And, it's funny. We got pushed a lot to define the data in data science in the writing of the book. And some of the revision we did was to clarify that term. But we were not, people didn't question the science, and that is actually, it is pretty interesting. But, I would sort of, I mean, maybe my answer to this, because it actually isn't one that I think I'm ready to offer, like what I think is my official definition of that term. But I do think that, this is what we say about data, it involves a commitment to systematic collection and analysis, right? And so, data can really be anything, right? It doesn't need to be numbers, it can be colors, it can be shoes. But if you are committed to a systematic or sort of collection and analysis of this particular type of thing that you're hoping to, or person that you're hoping to learn more about, then it counts. And similarly, I mean, I would push back on the idea, and I sit half my appointment now at Emory is 50% in the social sciences. And I do see this all the time, right? It's like, I think science is similarly closer to what many of us do, certainly in DH and even in the humanities, right? Which also just involves this commitment to sort of like systematic and methodological and informed investigation, right? And this is sort of a point that I was making in my final slide, is that we often, we as like I as a humanist, as a woman in tech spaces, like I often sort of hear those terms and things like those are not for me, but they're just terms, right? And I think that we as humanists have a lot to bring to that conversation, and what we do is not so different, and in many ways can deeply enhance the work that is being done in these spaces. So I would encourage Caroline to just sort of own it.
Perfect, thank you. Another one here from Lisa Chin. So do you see that there's a difference between data analytics and data science? Most data scientists would push back on the use of this phrase for anything that is not statistically rigorous.
Yeah, I mean, I think that they would, but I also think that they're wrong. I mean, and I think as humanists, we could point to the really great recent scholarship that has pointed to the 100-year history of statistics and pointed out how the genesis of this entire field essentially is eugenics, right? And all of these statistical measures were conceived within a very clearly defined social and political frame, right? And even things like, why is the cutoff like 0.05 for p-values, right? That was just arbitrary. Like, how was the normal distribution calculated? Initially it was anecdotal, right? And it was coming from people who were operating within a very narrow and racist and eugenicist worldview, right? And which is not to cast doubt on statistical methods. Like, I believe very much that it's important to make sure that we're not just a sort of asserting that numbers have some sort of inherent truth. And methods of hypothesis testing and validation are incredibly important. But I do think that this belief that like science in itself as being sort of inherently more truthful or valid than the other types of research that we do, that is something that is historically not true. And here, there's a really good history of this there's some books like, Banu Subramanian has this book called Ghost Stories for Darwin that is like a very deep dive into this history. But there was a piece that someone pointed me to in Nautilus magazine online, which is a sort of brief article length history of the emergence of statistics from eugenics that I'm going to see if I can find very quickly right now. But if not, then I'll just move on to the next question. Oh, wait, here, I did find it. There it is. It's in the chat.
All right, next question. Is data feminism a subfield of digital humanities, as these patterns of data cannot be observed without digital humanities data sets?
I love that question. I've been thinking about this a lot because, we were talking earlier about how I had just been to my first in-person symposium. Actually, I just arrived back this morning, and it was a digital humanities symposium-ish. And then coming to give this talk, I really feel like I'm coming home in a way. Data feminism, I think I would say I would flip it. I would say data feminism is an extension of the ways in which digital humanities has sort of taught me to see the world. And so I do think that digital humanities projects can be examples of this data feminist practice that we outline in the book, but it's not limited to humanities projects, right? Catherine's background is in design, and so a lot of what we talk about have to do with, for example, like I was talking in my talk, participatory design, co-design, things like that. And we also really were invested, we didn't want to be presentist in any way, and actually we were very careful to historicize most of the contemporary issues that we talk about, but we deliberately did try to pick sort of contemporary examples. And so in that way, I was probably like in the various hats that we wore in the project, I was probably the history one. But I was less invested in like historical coverage in the way that if I were putting together like an anthology of digital humanities projects, I'd be like, it's very important to capture, global reach, historical reach, things like this. Okay. That said, I do think that digital humanities projects are really valuable because they arise from a particular kind of humanistic, what other people call like domain expertise, but it's just like the areas in which we work, right? And we are often the ones who can identify and create these very small but very meaningful data sets that people who do sort of are more on the methods side or in more of the big data side just like don't even know how to see, let alone collect or understand their value. And so much of the like why I believe in what we said about in data feminism about how small data is just as important as big data and how big data can't tell you everything comes from just, the knowledge of the work that we do, that there are some data sets that are too small to do, do the new on, that require a significant amount of data, or, you learn the most just by counting them, or even the work that goes into creating a data set from data-ish, but not explicitly actual data set that you encounter like in an archive or in some sort of historical table or something like that. And we know the meaning that can come from that. And so in that way, I think that digital humanities projects are incredibly important because we make the case for why those types of projects and those types of data sets really matter.
Perfect. I'm going to move over to the chat because we had one that popped up there. Thank you so much for this presentation. I'm wondering if you can talk about the field of data feminism and specifically what you think are some of the key theoretical interventions that are emerging.
Sure. So first of all, it's like it continues to blow my mind that there's this field of data feminism, and that it's amazing, and I love it, but it's also deeply humbling. One of the really interesting things in writing the book, so we have in this last chapter where we sort of the gist of the conclusion is like, this is a conversation, like this is just one part of a conversation that began well before we showed up here. And we think that what needs to happen is like a multiplication of these types of questionings across lots of different domains. And so I would say one of the really exciting things that we've seen, and actually in a draft of the project, we tried to sort of sketch out what we thought, like what would like queer data look like, or what would like indigenous data practices look like. And then we took it out because we were like, we aren't the ones who have done the real work, who have put in the time in order to articulate what these fields might look like. We'd rather just sort of leave these open as additional sites for others with better knowledge of, this body of work and these particular communities to take on. And so one of the really cool things, and I would not attribute this to data feminism at all, I would just say this is like a parallel process, but has been really nice, has been the flourishing of like other, X data or data X, right? So like there's a new book on queer data, which is like, I don't know this person, but like there it is. That's exactly what we wanted to see. The real flourishing of conversations around indigenous data practices that are taking questions of relationality really seriously, protocols really seriously. I find that, that's so important. And that was less present like in 2018. Especially in conversations around AI when we were writing the book. So that's really exciting. I take no credit for it, but that's what I like. In terms of things that we didn't talk about in the book that are feminist, one of the really important conversations that in retrospect we maybe should or could have foregrounded more are questions around refusal. Questions of consent and refusal. These are actually very core feminist aims. And interestingly, I think some of the ways in which we touch on it from point to point, but I think the theoretical basis for a lot of the structure elided some of the feminist activist work where questions of consent and refusal are very central. And so folks who, like the folks behind the feminist data manifest know. Again, these are not related to us, but I think that work is a really good work in terms of centering questions of consent and refusal. And things like that. So I don't know if that's helpful, but those are some projects that I think are really exciting that I'm glad have sort of come up at around the same time so that we can be in dialogue with them.
Another one down in the chat that says, I'm working on a project about 19th century retail history, trying to identify women who worked in stores but lack obituaries. Any thoughts on how to refine them? And this actually makes me think of the question I was going to ask about counter data. So I'm very curious in your response to this.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, I feel like with these questions of invisibilized people, and they're often connected to questions of invisible labor, it's always a tension between trying to do really deep archival research so that you can find out as much as you can about individuals, or sort of find evocative descriptions of people, even if they are unnamed, and figure out ways to represent them. Whatever your unit is, like if it's data that you're going for, great. If it's like item in an Omeka site, great. But like sort of make them equivalent to be like, some people we have the names for, other people we have the descriptions for. These are all equal and equally worthy of study. And then the inverse of that, and this is something that I have been interested in for a very long time, and I did some of this in some of my early work, is trying to use data practices like visualization in order to hold space for the people who we just will never know about. And so I was very interested in this in terms of culinary labor. Some of my early work was about food. And there's an issue of this similarly, where it's like some people doing the cooking, we happen to know the names of these people because they happen to be related to notable families or closely connected to sites of power. But we know that like the kitchen, people working in the kitchen constituted a huge group of people, not all of whom are named. And some people will never know the names of. And so I was interested in ways that you can use data visualization in order to sort of hold space for some of these absences. More recently, I've been really interested in how scholars like Jessica Marie Johnson have taken, there's a theory generated by Jacob Gabory about the null value. It's actually a queer theory reading of databases, but talking about how, and like I guess DH people know this, like when you create like an old-fashioned relational database, before you have an entry for each individual data point, you need to sort of literally hold space in memory for the number to go. And so Jacob does a really nice theorization of what the sort of like holding space for the not yet determined or the resistant of being determined, like sort of how this is sort of a queer conception of data. And then Jessica Marie Johnson in her book, A Wicked Flesh, takes this idea sort of back to the archive. And she's particularly interested in the records of slavery and how sometimes there are gaps, like literal null values in these data tables. And that these women were living lives and doing things and going out and making friends and building kinship networks, right? But like we will never know what their names were, or how old they were, like the sorts of identifying information that we do know about other people. And her point is like it's really important to allow these to be empty, but to be meaningful absences, right? Not to sort of put recovery as the only goal, but to say like part of their meaning is the fact that we cannot reconstitute their lives with precision, and that is in some ways it's both like reflective of the violence, but it's also in some ways trying to resist the sort of reinscription of violence for us as scholars to sort of demand that we know every last thing about the historical subjects that we study. So that was not a practical suggestion at all, but I think that's a really interesting challenge. I will say though that the Alison Booth at UVA has this interesting prosopography project where one of the things that she's done is read back through contemporaneous anthologies and sort of books at the time that were trying to summarize contemporary, in her case, literary production. But she just does a really fine-grained reading combined with like a really flexible database in order to try to, even if there's a reference to like a girl in a shop, you allow that person to become an entity in the database, right? Even if you don't have any more identifying information like that, and to generate numbers like that.
Thank you so much. I'll hop back over to the Q&A. It is interesting to see the examples you shared come from many different places. While I have the impression that in DH many examples come from the English-speaking world. Do you think that people doing data feminism have other networks through feminism, and how could these networks contribute to new developments and challenges for the DH?
That is an amazing question. Okay, so two very specific answers. I would be remiss if I did not plug the very recently published Global Debates in the Digital Humanities volume, which exists in print now, but will be emerging open access very, very soon. If my internet has gotten very slow, but anyway, it's released from University of Minnesota Press. It's the series that I co-edit with Matt Gold. Anyway, so this takes up this exact question about the sort of assumptions of monolingualism, of Anglocentrism, and of global North focus that have like certainly characterized the most visible DH projects to date, right? Thank you for that. But, you know, this is not to say that there aren't digital humanities projects happening elsewhere in the world. And there's increasingly, and it's really exciting to me that there is more of more attempts at crossover, both on the part of sort of mostly American, but I would say like North American English speaking DH practitioners to pay attention to what's happening outside of my sort of minimal sphere. But also we've seen other projects from really other countries around the world sort of themselves enter a more global conversation. And so I think that's been really exciting. I think this has been interestingly tracked by a movement within machine learning and all of the language models that are currently very trendy. The question of the dominance of English as the base language of these models is like pretty much a central concern right now for the people developing these models. This is really interesting. And so I do feel like even though this balance is it's a deep imbalance right now, and it will take a long time to more equally and certainly more equitably balanced. I don't think it's going to be perfect anytime soon, but I am encouraged by a lot more conversations about this and a lot more national multilingual conversations than I certainly have seen in the past. With respect to feminism, like absolutely. And I would say, if anything, especially, you know, I don't know about as much about global feminisms. Like I said, I'm trained as an early Americanist, but one of the interesting things that's happened since writing Data Feminism is that, and Catherine especially pursuing research in Central and South America, is that we've been connected to this really, really amazing network of South American feminists, where it has been, you know, very visibly apparent, certainly to me and Catherine, that feminism in South America is much more developed and much more visible than it is in the United States. It's certainly the activist strain, right? Not the like, you know, I'm a mom, I'm gonna go march on Washington, but like actually like the feminist activists doing the work, to the point that last week I was meeting up with someone from Argentina, and she said she had a little green bandana on her bag, and she said, "Do you have one of these?" And I looked at it and I was like, I think I know what this is. And it was abortion rights protest bandana from when Argentina had to go through its own demands to protect abortion rights. And she was like, you need this, your country needs this. And she was actually saying that evidently, I did not know this, but that US-based abortion rights activists have been importing these exact bandanas from Argentina because we need them now in the United States. And so to me, this was the symbol, you know, it's like, you know, it is the reality, as you've described, is that it is not a unilateral or unidirectional spread of feminism from either English to Spanish speaking countries from global north to global south. Like that is not true, even if our knowledge of my knowledge of those groups is limited, right? And it is very much and oftentimes a needed exchange of the knowledge that comes from, for example, Argentina to the United States. So that was a slightly long-winded answer. Oh, and I will say that data feminism is in the process of being translated both into Spanish with an emphasis on Argentine Spanish, as well as Portuguese, Brazilian Portuguese. So those translations should be available open access in the coming couple of months.
Wow, that's amazing. We should try to get a translation going in French too.
Yeah, that would be awesome. I know I haven't spoken French for a very long time. I thought about it. I thought about doing a French intro, but then I realized I would get too embarrassed.
No, it would have been fine. Since I don't think we have another question, I'm going to ask a burning question I've had for you. If my understanding is correct, you have taught a course based on your work. And I'm wondering how, I mean, it's so beautifully set up that each week could have a chapter and there's so much to dive into, but I'm wondering when you bring this into the classroom, what types of projects do you have your students work on that accompany this text?
That's a really good question. So I've taught the book in two contexts. One for a more technical set of students, and then another for an emphatically non-technical set of students. And we did, one of the things, Catherine and I, in writing the book, we thought a lot about, and we talked a lot about who our main audiences were. And we very much wanted to reach, like I always had in mind, like an advanced undergraduate as one of my key readers, like a student who was interested, who wanted to learn, but who might not have familiarity with any particular school of thought or technical vocabulary or anything like that. And so I do like we've sort of designed the book to be teachable, and I'm pleased that it worked out in that way. So I've tried to follow the model that's sort of set up in the second chapter of analyzing, of data audits, of there's like so there's like a couple of types of projects that, again, we wrote the book mostly in 2018, a little bit into 2019, just because of how long it takes to get a book published. At the time, the most powerful forms of feminist data science seem to be like a counter data science, so like a pushing back against these dominant systems of power. So I've, for example, done like replication labs of the Gender Shades paper, Joy Buolamwini and Timnit Gebru's audit of the facial recognition software. I can actually, if you want, I can share that with you. Similarly, Os Keys did a really interesting sort of hand-coded analysis of how people who research automated gender recognition actually understand gender. And so one of the things that I tried to do was scale that up and to see if the findings held through a text analysis approach rather than a hand coding kind of project. I've done sort of like basic statistical sort of thought experiments where you perform a data analysis and you get what seems to be a conclusive answer, but then you can sort of ask a series of questions to make it clear that the answer that is pointed by that particular approach is excluding, either foreclosing other questions or excluding certain people. And in this regard, Evan Peck has a great series of modules called from his ethical CS curriculum that does things like a very, very basic resume screening algorithm, where, for example, you're given a spreadsheet of student grades and you run through a practice that says like, okay, so if you're a hirer, you might want, the students with the best grades. So who are the students who have the best average? Or you might want students who have taken certain numbers taken the advanced classes. So count the number of advanced classes they've taken. And then he'll sort of go back and say like, well, what about the student who showed the greatest improvement, right? Like you might want that student who starts out knowing nothing, but ends up getting 100. But you might miss that if you're looking at averages. Or for example, like what about a student with a death in the family in their sophomore year, right? Like how do you account for that? And so there's some really basic math that can lead to really provocative questions. Actually, Meredith Broussard in Artificial Unintelligence has another really good like reframing. There's a very sort of canonical almost like toy example that's used in basic stats classes that has to do with the data associated with the Titanic. But she does this really nice reframing, showing how essentially it's like all the first class passengers on one side of the boat who survive, and the statistics, like the statistical analysis, doesn't point you there, right? You need to know like how the class hierarchy of the ship and the incidental fact that like one side of the ship had lifeboats and the other side didn't, or something like that. So and that's sort of traced out and actually like in code in her book. So examples like that. But then there's one more thing that I was going to say, which is, so like initially it was sort of thought experiments and audits, but it began to sort of grate on me that they were all sort of like the resistance to the dominant data science, and they weren't imagining other ways of doing data science. And so increasingly, I've been trying to think about ways that push us in new directions. And the example that I found, it's a conceptual example, but I found it really inspiring, is Wendy Chun's new book, Discriminating Data. And she makes the point that a lot of these predictive models, like we know that they sort of show us and amplify the biases of the past, but we're sort of using them wrong. And her point is like, no, we don't generate these models so that we can keep on doing it. We generate these models so we have evidence of prior bias that we can then intentionally make different decisions so that the future does not look like the past. And she's like, lest you think this is impossible to conceive, we need to think about the use of climate change models, right? People model horrific predictions of future climate change, I mean, ideally, although not in practice, so that we can make better decisions, right? And so rather than just say like, oh no, the algorithm is biased, it's like, okay, great, it showed us the bias. Now let's do something different. And so I've been thinking a little bit more about simulations and ways to think about how we might sort of actively redistribute different components of models so that we can sort of engineer a different future.
You've just given me about 10 new teaching ideas. Thank you so much.
It's all the early course, which admittedly got kind of interrupted by COVID, so it breaks down like in March, but it's all on GitHub. So if you or anyone wants to take a look, it's in my GitHub. It's called Feminist Data Science. I have some of these, not all of them. And then I taught another course called Data Justice that has some more. That was a co-taught class, and so it was like a little bit more. There's a little bit more like political science and game theory in it. But that one I think is also on GitHub if you follow the links.
Thank you so much. I think this will be our last question, which is in the chat. Hello, thanks for the lecture. Just to contribute, I'm Brazilian and I'm developing a DH research on Brazilian female writers. It's been hard to find ways to put my ideas into practice even more from feminist and decolonial perspective, but we're making progress. That's why research like yours is so important. Thanks again. I love that. Thank you so much. That's like the perfect note to end this presentation on, to end DHSITE on. Thank you again for being our keynote speaker this week. It's an absolute honor, and I will speak for everybody who is in attendance today to say that this really was an inspiring talk. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm going to go look up your own curriculum and find out what you've been learning all week, and I'll really look forward to the projects that result from this.
Thank you so much. Have a great weekend, everybody.
Take care, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.